Arben Lika, the ruthless Albanian strategist, and Tommy Red Gallagher, Liverpool's street king, never imagined their paths would collide, but when shadowy deals, vanished shipments, and a city on edge bring them face to face, Liverpool becomes a battlefield where loyalty, betrayal, and survival hang by a thread. Liverpool had always been known for its docks, its music, and its tight-knit neighborhoods. But over the past year, something had begun to shift. In quiet corners of the city, a presence that nobody had expected was taking root. It started with the whispers among local street gangs, rumors of strangers moving in, strangers who didn't act like anyone the city had seen before. These newcomers didn't argue over small territories. They didn't boast loudly in local pubs, and they didn't seek attention. They were disciplined, controlled, and precise in everything they did. Liverpool's older gangs initially ignored them, thinking they were just another set of dealers trying to carve out a small corner of the market. They didn't know the newcomers were part of an Albanian network with experience in multiple European countries, a network that moved silently, leaving no traces that could be followed. The first signs were subtle: shipments arriving at unusual hours at the docks, cargo being unloaded in places no one normally went, vehicles registered under false names. The Albanians were meticulous. They studied the city, its patterns, and its vulnerabilities. They understood the old gangs relied heavily on local contacts, bribes, and intimidation, but their methods were chaotic and unpredictable. The Albanians operated differently. They used calculated risk, technology, and extreme secrecy to gain control. Within months, local dealers began to notice a change in the streets. Cocaine was suddenly more abundant and purer than ever before. Prices dropped, and for the first time, ordinary customers could access drugs that were usually reserved for the wealthy or connected. It was a sign that the new players were not here to blend in, they were here to dominate. Police had only vague suspicions. A few officers noticed new vans and trucks moving in and out of old warehouses near the docks. But the networks were careful, using multiple layers of anonymity and coded communication. Informants rarely survived long enough to provide useful details. By the time the city realized what was happening, the Albanian network had already established supply chains, recruited local enforcers, and created a reputation for ruthless efficiency. Their presence was invisible on paper, but the effects were everywhere. Street corners, clubs, and even suburban neighborhoods began to feel the shift in power. The local gangs felt the pressure immediately. Territories that had been uncontested for decades were suddenly flooded with competitors who never argued, never made mistakes, and always seemed one step ahead. Any attempt to push back often failed because the Albanians planned every move carefully, predicting responses and setting traps to maintain control. Within weeks, the newcomers were not just another criminal element, they were an unstoppable force, a quiet storm reshaping Liverpool's underworld. The city didn't notice the danger at first, but the old gangs did. And while the residents went about their daily lives, unaware of the silent invasion, a battle for the heart of Liverpool's streets was beginning. The Albanians weren't just selling drugs, they were rewriting the rules of the city, and anyone who got in their way would soon realize there was no room for mercy. The quiet, disciplined rise of the Albanian network would mark the beginning of a war that Liverpool had never seen before. As Liverpool's streets adjusted to the sudden presence of the Albanian network, another, more chilling pattern began to emerge. Independent brokers, the middlemen who connected local gangs to suppliers, started disappearing. At first, it was dismissed as normal criminal turnover, someone skipping town, someone hiding from trouble, but soon the disappearances became too frequent to ignore. One broker vanished near Toxteth, leaving his car abandoned on a quiet side street. Another simply failed to return from a meeting in Boodle, his phone inactive, his contacts left guessing. These were not ordinary cases of missing people. There were no signs of struggle, no bodies left behind, no ransom demands. It was as if they had been erased from existence. A fear spread quickly among Liverpool's older gangs. These brokers were the lifeblood of the local underworld, the men who knew every route, every supplier, and every safe house. Without them, operations slowed, shipments were delayed, and trust between criminal factions began to crumble. Rumors circulated that the Albanian network was systematically removing anyone who could challenge their control. They didn't attack openly. They didn't issue threats or leave messages. They simply made problems disappear. The effect was immediate and devastating. Gangs that had operated for decades suddenly found themselves vulnerable, unsure of who could be trusted and who might vanish next. For the Albanian network, the disappearances were a calculated strategy. They understood that power in Liverpool was not just about controlling drugs. It was about controlling information and connections. By removing the brokers, they cut off the local gangs from their supply chains, leaving them scrambling for access. The network's operatives replaced those lost connections with their own people, carefully chosen and trained to follow orders without question. Each new recruit reinforced the network's growing influence, making it increasingly impossible for local gangs to regain the upper hand. Meanwhile, law enforcement struggled to make sense of the pattern. Missing person reports piled up, but without concrete evidence, investigations led nowhere. Officers began to suspect internal gang conflicts, assuming that local rivalries had escalated into deadly consequences. What they could not see was the bigger picture. A foreign network was silently taking over the city, and Liverpool's criminal landscape was being reshaped from the shadows. The disappearances also had a psychological effect on the local underworld. Fear spread faster than violence. Gangs that might have resisted the newcomers now hesitated to act, unsure of the risks. Every meeting, every deal, every move on the streets carried the weight of uncertainty. The Albanian network's reputation grew not through showy attacks, but through a cold, calculated elimination of anyone who could threaten their expansion. By the time local gangs realized what was happening, it was already too late. Key players had vanished, territories were subtly infiltrated, and the city's underworld had begun to tilt toward the newcomers. Liverpool was no longer just a collection of competing gangs. It was the starting point of a silent invasion, orchestrated with precision. The streets that had once been familiar and predictable were now dangerous in ways no one could fully understand. And for the people living in those neighborhoods, the presence of a ruthless, unseen force had begun to define their lives, quietly controlling the flow of power and fear in the heart of the city. Liverpool's docks had always been the city's lifeblood, a network of shipping lanes and warehouses that connected the city to the wider world. But in the quiet of the night, beneath the hum of distant cranes and the flicker of dockside lights, a more sinister operation was unfolding. Containers were arriving as usual, but something about them seemed off. Seals that should have been intact were slightly misaligned, markings subtly altered. Only those with trained eyes could notice, but those who did notice too late. The Albanian network had begun exploiting the docks with a precision that shocked even experienced longshoremen. Hidden compartments had been installed inside shipping crates, designed so expertly that nothing inside could be detected during routine inspections. Smugglers, police, and rival gangs alike were unaware of the full extent of the operation. Workers who had been used to the ebb and flow of the port began noticing patterns. Certain trucks only arrived at odd hours, always under the cover of darkness. Containers were moved between warehouses in ways that seemed illogical, yet no one questioned it. The Albanians had bribed a few port officials, but the majority of their control came from fear and intimidation. Those who had resisted the newcomers' instructions found their vehicles vandalized, their cargo damaged, or worse, found themselves disappearing for days. Rumors spread among the dock workers, a whispering network of warning signs. Some shipments were off limits, some areas were dangerous, and anyone who tried to investigate did so at their own peril. The scale of the Albanian network's planning became apparent when investigators began piecing together reports from informants and anonymous tips. Every move at the docks was calculated to avoid detection. Surveillance cameras were avoided or manipulated. Logistics were timed to the minute, ensuring minimal overlap with police patrols. Their maritime routes extended beyond Liverpool, connecting the city to ports across Europe where enforcement was equally lax or easily corrupted. The Albanian network operated like a machine, each cog perfectly calibrated, every participant knowing their role without question. Liverpool's local gangs had attempted to intervene, trying to intercept shipments or gather intelligence. But every effort failed. Warehouses would be empty when they arrived, or containers would be rerouted at the last minute. Those who tried to follow the network's movements often found themselves ambushed or watched from a distance. The Albania's understanding of technology, surveillance, and urban terrain gave them an edge that local gangs could not overcome. The docks were no longer a neutral space. They had become the chessboard for a foreign power that was rewriting the rules of criminal enterprise in the city. The quiet efficiency of the operation left the city unaware of the growing threat. To the average resident, shipping containers were just part of the landscape. Trucks came and went, and the docks continued their work without interruption. But beneath the surface, a war for control of Liverpool's streets and resources was intensifying. The Albanian network had established not just supply chains, but a system of fear and obedience, ensuring that anyone who might interfere would think twice. Their influence extended beyond drugs and violence. It controlled knowledge, movement, and survival itself. By the end of the year, it was clear that Liverpool's docks had become a fortress, an invisible stronghold for the Albanian network. The city's old gangs, once confident in their local power, now faced an enemy who did not rely on reputation or loud displays of force. The Albanians moved silently, leaving no evidence, yet leaving every observer aware that something powerful, disciplined, and unstoppable had taken root in the heart of Liverpool. The war had entered a new phase, one that promised to reshape the city entirely. Tensions in Liverpool as Underworld reached a breaking point when a major cocaine shipment disappeared without a trace. The city's largest street gang, long accustomed to controlling the flow of drugs in their territories, immediately suspected the newcomers. The Albanians, however, did not respond in the chaotic, retaliatory manner that local gangs expected. Instead, they acted with calculated precision, striking back in ways that seemed almost surgical. Burnt-out vehicles, destroyed stash houses, and targeted intimidation became the new reality. Each attack was designed not only to punish, but to send a message. Resistance came with consequences, and mistakes were costly. Local gangs had grown accustomed to disputes that could be settled with a few threats or displays of force. But the Albanians' methods were different. They studied their opponents, mapped their movements, and exploited weaknesses with a patience that unnerved even the most experienced criminals. A small act of defiance could trigger repercussions days or weeks later, sometimes in locations where victims felt safest. Liverpool's streets, once predictable for gang activity, had become unpredictable and dangerous in a way no one had anticipated. The feud escalated quickly. Small skirmishes in the back streets of Everton and Anfield turned into coordinated strikes against entire neighborhoods. Molotov cocktails were left at abandoned warehouses, packages of illicit goods were destroyed in public spaces, and rumors spread of unseen snipers watching key locations. The Albanians maintained control over their actions, never overextending themselves, while local gangs struggled to respond without exposing themselves. The city became a chessboard, with each move met by a countermove that seemed impossible to anticipate. What terrified local gang members the most was the level of intelligence the Albanians appeared to possess. They knew which leaders were away from their homes, which associates were vulnerable, and which routes were frequently monitored by law enforcement. No one could explain how the newcomers gained such precise information, and no one dared to ask. The sense of omnipresence created a psychological advantage far beyond any physical confrontation. Fear became a weapon, and Liverpool's streets were the battleground. Meanwhile, the city's residents began to notice subtle signs of the conflict. Errant vehicles abandoned in alleys, graffiti warning of retaliation, and the occasional explosion at warehouses hinted at the war taking place just beneath the surface. While few knew the full story, those living in affected neighborhoods learned quickly that even minor encounters could escalate rapidly. Parents worried about children playing outside. Shopkeepers grew cautious about deliveries, and ordinary citizens began to avoid areas previously considered safe. The feud between the gangs and the Albanians was no longer contained within the underworld. It had begun to seep into daily life. Despite the chaos, the Albanians avoided drawing police attention directly. Their attacks were precise, leaving minimal forensic evidence, and their movements were cloaked in legitimate logistics whenever possible. Local gangs, in contrast, often reacted impulsively, leaving trails of destruction that made them easier to track. The result was a city where the traditional balance of power had shifted dramatically. The Albanians were no longer just newcomers. They were a dominant force, and the feud had become a warning to anyone who thought they could challenge them. By the time the dust settled from the initial wave of attacks, Liverpool had changed. The old gangs had learned a harsh lesson about underestimating outsiders. The streets had grown quieter in some areas, not due to peace, but due to fear. The Albanians had proven that control could be maintained without noise or spectacle, and the local gangs knew that the war was far from over. Every corner of the city, from the docks to residential neighborhoods, had become a stage for a silent, calculated conflict that showed no sign of slowing down. Amid the chaos of Liverpool's escalating gang war, a hidden figure moved quietly in the shadows. He was a former police analyst who had disappeared from official records after exposing corruption within the force. No one knew where he had gone, or if he even remained in the city, but he had not abandoned his work. From a secluded apartment in the outskirts of Liverpool, he monitored the activities of both the local gangs and the Albanian network. His access to confidential databases, surveillance tools, and old contacts allowed him to track movements that no ordinary citizen could notice. Every shipment, every unusual meeting, every unexplained disappearance was meticulously logged, analyzed, and cross-referenced. The analyst had a personal stake in remaining invisible. He knew that revealing himself could make him a target for both sides. The local gangs would see him as a spy working with law enforcement, while the Albanians would consider him a threat to their secrecy. To avoid detection, he used multiple layers of anonymity, encrypted communication, and constantly changing locations. Even within his own network of informants, very few knew his true identity. He became the ghost that observed the war from above, unseen and untouchable, feeding bits of critical intelligence anonymously to the authorities. Through his investigation, he uncovered evidence that the gang war in Liverpool was part of a much larger operation. Transactions between the city and Albania were encoded in ways that masked the flow of money for drugs, weapons, and logistics. Offshore accounts, shell companies, and digital currencies were all part of the network system, allowing them to expand across Europe without leaving a trace. What Liverpool's local gangs faced was not merely an invasion of territory. It was the first visible front of an international operation designed for expansion, dominance, and complete control. The analyst documented the Albanians' movements with painstaking detail. He noted the precision of their strikes, the timing of shipments, and the methods used to avoid detection by both law enforcement and rival gangs. He mapped supply routes that stretched from Mediterranean ports to the city's docks, showing how a single shipment could move through multiple countries undisturbed. His notes revealed that the Albanians had studied Liverpool long before setting foot in the city, learning the strengths and weaknesses of local gangs, police routines, and community dynamics. While law enforcement received some of his intelligence, the analyst remained careful not to reveal too much. He knew that premature disclosure could compromise investigations, tip off the Albanians, or ignite violent retaliation. His messages were cryptic, precise, and delivered through intermediaries, ensuring that those who received the information understood only what they needed to. Even in the midst of violence and fear, he maintained a sense of order, documenting every irregularity, every pattern, and every potential threat. As the war unfolded in Liverpool, the analyst's work became increasingly vital. Without him, authorities were blind to the network's sophistication, and local gangs could not anticipate the newcomer's strategies. Yet, despite his efforts, he remained a ghost unknown, uncredited, and operating under constant risk. His presence highlighted a crucial truth. The conflict was not just physical, it was informational. The side that controlled knowledge, tracked movements, and understood the hidden structures of power would hold the real advantage. In the shadows, he prepared for a moment when that knowledge could change the course of the war entirely, though no one in the city yet realized how significant his role would become. The war for Liverpool as streets took an unexpected turn when a key lieutenant within the Albanian network made a decision that would shape the city's criminal underworld. Ambition, fear, and self-preservation collided, and he chose to betray the leaders he had once followed without question. For weeks, he had secretly communicated with Liverpool's local gangs, providing them with sensitive information about supply routes, storage locations, and shipment schedules. He believed that by helping the locals, he could secure his own safety and carve out a position of power for himself once the network as leaders were removed. The lieutenant's betrayal, however, was far more dangerous than he realized. The Albanian network, known for its meticulous planning and paranoia, had anticipated the possibility of internal treachery. What the lieutenant thought was valuable intelligence had been carefully staged to mislead. The shipments he revealed to the local gangs were not what they seemed. Warehouses were rigged with surveillance cameras, hidden listening devices, and tracking mechanisms that allowed the Albanians to monitor every move. The local gangs, acting on the information they believed would give them the upper hand, walked directly into traps designed to expose their strength, numbers, and locations. When the raids occurred, the local gangs realized too late that they had been outmaneuvered. Members were caught on camera, stash houses were discovered and emptied, and routes they thought were secret were now fully documented by the network. The betrayal that had seemed like a turning point instead became a disaster, reinforcing the Albanians' dominance over the city. The lieutenant, initially confident in his strategy, now faced the terrifying reality that he had underestimated the intelligence, planning, and ruthlessness of the organization he had betrayed. The double cross not only humiliated the local gangs, but also demonstrated the Albanians' ability to manipulate human weakness as effectively as they managed shipments and logistics. Trust became a scarce commodity. Local gang leaders realized that even their own allies could not be relied upon, while the Albanians' reputation for foresight and control reached new heights. The streets of Liverpool were no longer just a battlefield for drugs and territory. They had become a psychological game, where every decision carried enormous risk and the consequences of misjudgment could be fatal. Meanwhile, the lieutenant's actions set off a ripple effect. Local gangs, now suspicious of every member and every move, began second-guessing plans and withdrawing from areas they had once controlled. Law enforcement, observing the chaos, struggled to determine the full scope of the operations, while residents of affected neighborhoods sensed a growing invisible tension in their streets. Violence had become sporadic yet unpredictable, creating an atmosphere of constant unease. The Albanian network's silent hand guided the city's criminal activity with near-perfect control, exploiting mistakes while minimizing exposure. By the end of the episode, the lesson was clear. Betrayal could be as lethal as bullets. The Albanians had turned an act of treachery into an advantage, solidifying their control and demonstrating that in their world, strategy mattered more than strength, patience more than aggression. Liverpool's gangs, once confident in their local knowledge, now faced an opponent who anticipated every move, used every weakness, and remained several steps ahead. The streets had become a deadly game of deception, and the city's underworld had learned that no secret was truly safe from those who played by rules they themselves had invented. After months of silent maneuvering and calculated attacks, authorities finally moved to strike at the heart of the Albanian network. Pressure from the public, combined with intelligence gathered from anonymous tips and the undercover analyst, led police to an unassuming construction site on the outskirts of Liverpool. On the surface, it appeared ordinary, a partially built warehouse surrounded by fencing and heavy machinery. But beneath the ground, hidden under layers of concrete and reinforced steel, lay a bunker designed with military precision. The network had anticipated raids and created a fortress nearly impossible to detect, even with modern surveillance technology. Inside the bunker, the scale of the operation was staggering. Stacks of encrypted files filled filing cabinets, each folder meticulously labeled and cross-referenced. Computers hummed quietly, storing digital records of shipments, financial transactions, and contacts spanning multiple countries. Maps of European ports, shipping lanes, and overland routes lined the walls, each marked with symbols indicating risk levels, schedules, and alternate paths. Investigators realized that Liverpool was merely the first node in a vast network designed for rapid expansion and maximum profit. The organization's reach extended far beyond the city, touching countries where authorities had little awareness of the system in place. The bunker contained more than just records. Forged documents, passports, and identification cards were neatly organized, ready to be deployed at a moment's notice. The meticulousness of the operation revealed a level of discipline rarely seen in criminal enterprises, highlighting the network's professionalism and ruthlessness. Police officers noted the absence of haphazard planning, improvisation, or carelessness. Everything was structured, controlled, and executed with exacting standards. It was clear that the Albanian network had operated in Liverpool for months, if not years, without leaving any overt signs of their presence. Despite the intelligence breakthrough, the raid exposed one uncomfortable truth: the network was always one step ahead. Some servers were missing, documents had been shredded or removed, and certain areas were booby-trapped with security measures that slowed the investigation. It became apparent that the leaders had not anticipated failure. They had contingency plans to protect the organization, even if the authorities breached the bunker. Every file recovered told part of the story, but every missing piece hinted at resources, contacts, and operations that remained beyond reach. The investigation was only scratching the surface of a well-oiled criminal machine. The psychological impact on local law enforcement was profound. For years, Liverpool's gangs had been treated as the dominant players in the city's underworld, but the discovery of the bunker shattered that perception. The Albanians had not only infiltrated the city's criminal ecosystem, they had created a controlled, highly efficient parallel system operating above and around the local gangs. The sophistication of the network suggested an intelligence and planning capacity comparable to that of state organizations. Police understood that the war in Liverpool was no longer just a matter of street-level violence. It was part of an international operation designed for expansion, control, and evasion. As officers continued to catalog evidence, a troubling realization settled over the team. The leaders of the network could still be at large, their influence unbroken. The city had been only the first battlefield. The bunker raid had revealed the inner workings of the organization, but it had not stopped the network itself. The Albanians had prepared for exposure, had anticipated the intrusion, and had secured their operations so that even setbacks could be absorbed without threatening the core of their empire. Liverpool's streets might appear safer temporarily, But the shadow of the network stretched far beyond the city, and the full extent of its power was only beginning to be understood. Even after the bunker raid, the threat of the Albanian network lingered like a dark cloud over Liverpool. Investigators believed they had seized critical evidence, yet the sense of incompleteness weighed heavily on the operation. As officers sifted through the recovered files and mapped the destroyed or missing servers, one fact became impossible to ignore. Someone had acted just minutes before the raid. A lone figure, moving with remarkable speed and precision, had slipped through a maintenance tunnel, escaping with critical data that could not yet be accounted for. Surveillance footage was grainy, the image almost spectral, but it was clear that the individual was trained, purposeful, and aware of the risks. Neither law enforcement nor local gangs could confirm whether he was an insider, a rogue operative, or an agent of the Albanian network itself. The escape changed everything. Analysts realized that the network's leaders had anticipated infiltration and had taken steps to protect their core operations. The missing data likely contained the locations of shipments, safe houses, financial accounts, and contacts in other cities. The city's investigators understood that while they had made a significant seizure, the network itself remained intact, adaptive, and operational. This revelation sent shockwaves through the police force. Every previous assumption about the war in Liverpool had to be reconsidered. The city was no longer just a battleground. It was a testing ground for a network that could move, adapt, and strike without warning. Meanwhile, reports of new drug flows began appearing in cities like Manchester and Birmingham, suggesting that the Albanian network had already begun to expand. These developments indicated that the organization's operations were not dependent on any single location. Liverpool had been only the starting point. Fear remained a constant companion, not only because of the network's known acts of violence, but because of their ability to remain unseen. Rumors of surveillance, informants, and hidden operatives created an atmosphere of paranoia. No one knew who could be trusted, and no street, warehouse, or alley felt safe. Even leaders of local gangs hesitated to move openly, understanding that the Albanians could strike at any time and from unexpected directions. Liverpool, once confident in its local underworld, now existed in a state of tense anticipation. The public remained largely unaware of the ongoing shadow war. To ordinary residents, the city seemed quieter after the bunker raid, yet the streets carried an undercurrent of tension. The Albanians had shifted their operations deeper into secrecy, ensuring that their presence continued to shape the city without drawing overt attention. Their influence extended into logistics, finance, and recruitment, allowing them to maintain control while avoiding detection. By the end of the operation, it was clear that the conflict in Liverpool was far from resolved. For local gangs, law enforcement, and citizens alike, the war had shifted from the visible streets into hidden corridors of influence, where the rules were rewritten and survival depended on understanding a threat that could never be fully seen.